everyone, how's it going? Matthew Bailey Media here, and welcome to another tier list video. I know it's been a while since I've done these, but one of these. But the first, I will say though that the next tier list video that I got for you today, as you can tell by the title of this video, is I'm going to be ranking all the different horror movies that I have seen over the last few months, weeks, whatever. Now, there are some that I have seen that I actually forgot to include in this video once I recorded it, but I will eventually decide after a few more horror movies that I've managed to see, I'll maybe update it and maybe make another video about it. But for now, I'm just going to give you my current list of movies that I put on this list and which movies that I liked, thought were okay, great, or that I hated. So without further ado, let's get into the tier list for the horror movies that I've seen. Now, there is one movie on here that has two different, if you can tell, there's two copies of the same movie on here, but I'll get to that when I get to it. But anyways, let's get into this list. So, the first movie I have is The Babysitter. Now, this is a Netflix movie that came out back in, I believe it was 2017, and I will say I was pretty surprised that it was considered a horror movie. I mean, I really was surprised. It seemed like The Babysitter, as it's named in the movie, turns out to be like a part of a cult that made a deal with the devil, and they need the blood of the innocent mixed with the blood of the sacrificed. It was an interesting film. And I gotta say, this movie, on the other hand, probably deserves to be in maybe like the B tier. I thought it was okay. I mean, it wasn't as crazy as I thought it would be, but next up we got the sequel to The Babysitter, Killer Queen. And I will say this, to me, I thought was actually better than the first one, because it even hints that there could be another movie, even with the same guy, of Cole Evans, I think is his name. And this is also one of Jenna Ortega's first ever appearances as well, which I thought was interesting. And I will say I actually did like it more than the first movie. Next up, we got Megan. Now, Megan is actually the only movie in this entire lineup that was rated PG-13. Well, actually, I think The Babysitter and The Babysitter Killer Queen were also rated PG-13. I think. I'm not 100% sure, but it's funny because this movie I actually really enjoyed, and this is one of the first few movies that goes into the A tier. It wasn't a successful movie, but I thought it was a good film. Next up, we've got the original Halloween from 1978. Now, it's been a while since I've seen this movie, but I still thought it was like one of the better movies of the... In fact, I actually do kind of prefer it over Megan, but I still thought it was really good. Next up, we got Halloween 2. Oh, and in case I forgot to mention that we are getting into all the franchises now, where you see every single movie that came out within that franchise. So, Halloween 2. Now, this is interesting because Halloween 2 is actually like a separate timeline from the first, is one out of two timelines that we're going to be discussing for this franchise. And this sort of makes it seem like both Michael Myers and Laurie Strode are actually siblings in this universe, and I thought it was crazy that they went that route. And I gotta say, I actually did not think it did as good. I mean, I will say I think I actually find it better than The Babysitter, I will admit. Next up is Halloween 4. I don't remember exactly what the names of these movies are, so I'll just call them Halloween 4, 5, and 6. But with Halloween 4, this introduces us to the one daughter out of two separate different daughters for Laurie Strode, where she unfortunately seems to be dead after the second movie, and she had her daughter, and but she was adopted by this other family, but it reveals that Michael Myers has returned in some way, and he wants to make sure that he removes every single family member from his lineup. And I will admit, I didn't think about how crazy this story was. Heck, it even sort of ended just like the first movie began, when young Michael was in a clown costume, and he ended up killing somebody. And I forgot exactly who the young girl killed, who was the daughter of Laurie Strode, but it seemed like he passed on his stuff to her. And the fifth movie will explain a little bit more on that. But with the fourth movie, I gotta go put this movie probably in the C category. I didn't think it was that bad, but it could have done better. Next up, we got Halloween 5. Now, again, this is supposed to be the continuation of the fourth movie with the daughter and all that sort of stuff. And I gotta say, I didn't think it would be as good as I thought it would be, but I will say I actually don't like this one as much as the fourth one, mainly because the way that they handled that was not too great, with the way they handled Michael being defeated and all that. But then we get to Halloween 6, which I think is called The Curse of Michael Myers, I believe. But it's revealed in the sixth movie. Now, it does have a time jump with the same daughter, and she's about to have, I think, her own... I think she's about to have her own baby, but it's revealed that she has to defeat Michael in a way for this to work. And I will say, I did think it was a little bit better than the fifth one, but not as much. Next, we move on to the second version of Michael Myers, or the second trilogy that continues off of the very first Halloween from 1978, where we have Laurie Strode, who's a grandmother now. She did have a daughter in the timeline, and she had, and her daughter had a child, where she now has a granddaughter. And this movie, I will admit, it's just as good as the original movie. It seemed like I will say it's not as good as the first original Halloween, but I still think it was good enough to where they were gonna be like moving on. Like the way that they handled this reboot, this sort of revival to the /reboot to the franchise. I thought that the first movie was so good. I thought that the sequel and the third movie would do well, but unfortunately it didn't, because now we move on to Halloween Kills, where it sort of takes place on the exact same night, early November 1st, for this timeline. And we thought Michael would be done, but it turns out gets accidentally rescued by some firefighters who go to put out the fire in Laurie Strode's house that she has been setting up years to prepare for Michael to get trapped in there. And unfortunately, the firefighters accidentally help free him from his so-called prison, and he goes on a rampage. And we don't even see Laurie Strode throughout most of this movie. She doesn't even get most of the action. She's mostly in the hospital. And I will admit though, I do find it better than the fourth, fifth, and sixth movies, but not as good as I was hoping for. And then we move to Halloween Ends. Now, this movie, I gotta be totally honest, I don't know what they were thinking when it comes to the way they ended this trilogy, because in Halloween Kills, they actually kill off Laurie Strode's daughter, but the granddaughter manages to survive. She then moves in with her grandmother and tries... This movie takes place 4 years after the events of the first two movies, and then we get introduced to this new character. I forgot his name, but he's sort of like being made to be the new Michael Myers, at least in the eyes of Haddonfield, or whatever. of Haddonfield residents, especially when a year after the events of the first two movies, he goes to babysit a kid, and he gets so frustrated with the kid when he's playing tricks on him as they're playing hide and seek that he pushes the door so hard the kid falls down a huge amount of flight of stairs to the ground floor and gets killed. And those parents never forgave him, especially the mother. But again, they sort of make him out to be like the new Michael Myers in a way, and he doesn't interact with Michael, who has been in hiding for the last 4 years, ever since his original childhood home got torn down after those events. And I gotta say, this movie definitely did not do as good as I was hoping for. I put it in the D category. I will say it's not as good as these other Halloween films from the original franchise, but it definitely didn't do very well in my opinion. Next up, now we're moving on to the Scream franchise. With the very first Scream, I'm putting it in the A category. Heck, I may actually put it just above the original Halloween. I really enjoyed it, if I'm being totally honest. Again, Billy Loomis and Stu Macher, played by the iconic Matthew Lillard, Shaggy Rogers himself from Scooby-Doo, they really nailed their performances as the killers in this movie. Again, this is obviously a spoiler warning for anyone who hasn't seen these franchises yet, or these films. Next up, we've got Scream 2. Now, I gotta say, Scream 2, it definitely picked up where the first movie left off, and it involves, and the killers are revealed to be one of the so-called students and friends of theirs in college, and the other one turns out to be the mother of Billy Loomis, Nancy Loomis, but she goes by an alias known as Debbie Salt, and I gotta say, I was pretty surprised by that. And I will say, it's not a bad movie. Heck, I wouldn't even say it goes just above The Babysitter Killer Queen. And I will say, I thought it was okay. But then we get to Scream 3. Now, I know Scream 3 is like the most hated one of the entire franchise, and I totally agree. But is it bad enough to end up in the F tier? Not necessarily. I will say I did think I will say I actually kind of preferred this movie over Halloween Ends when it comes to being in the D category, but I didn't like the way that this movie ended up going. Plus, it only had one single person being Ghostface, which is strange because it seemed, I was always wondering, like, how the heck are they, is this guy able to pull it off as a single Ghostface? But then we get to Scream 4. Now, Scream 4 is the other good movie in that original 4 films that people were not too happy about why it ended up being received poorly at the box office. But I will say I actually did find it to be better than Scream 2, but it still doesn't top the A category. Now we move on to the newest films that have come out over the last year and a half, almost 2 years now, and with Scream 2022, aka Scream 5, where it is revealed that this movie takes place in the year 2022, so almost 25 years to the day since the original Scream took place, and it brings back the legacy characters that are still alive, and however, it introduces us to the illegitimate daughter of Billy Loomis, where apparently during the events of the first Scream, he was actually cheating on Sidney with another girl, Christina Carpenter. And it turns out that, and now I'm not sure if we saw Christina in the first movie, but she was definitely apparently dating Billy at the same time that he was dating Sidney, and I will say that was a pretty interesting twist to put on the film. And this is the first movie to not be directed by Wes Craven, and I will say the way that they handled it was, in my opinion, I actually preferred it over the 2018 Halloween. And then we move on to Scream 6. Now, Scream 6 it's funny because in Scream 5, the final battle takes place in the exact same spot as the first movie, which was Stu Macher's house. And then in the sixth movie, it kind of mirrors the events of Scream 2, where it takes place in a movie theater in a way. And this is the first movie to actually have 3 killers. And it also kind of mirrors the same thing when it comes to the family member that is getting revenge on the heroes killing one of the killers in the 5th movie. And they're also related in a way. And it was basically a father and his 2 children that were getting revenge for the Carpenter sisters killing their brother, who's revealed in the 5th film as Richie Kirsch, who is one of the killers. And I will say, I actually did like it. In fact, I think I even like it more than Scream 4, and even better than Scream 2, in my opinion. And I'm really curious to see how Scream 7, which whenever that movie comes out, I may end up updating this tier list. It just depends, but we'll see what happens. Now we move on to the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise. Now I recently just watched both this and the Friday the 13th universe, and I gotta say, the very first Nightmare on Elm Street, which was one of the first movies directed by Wes Craven, I gotta admit, this is actually one of the first movies I'm putting in the S tier. It's my highest rated movie out of the entire franchise, out of all these horror movies that I've ranked, and I gotta say, I really enjoyed it. Next up, we got A Nightmare on Elm Street 2, Freddy's Revenge. Now, this supposedly takes place 5 years later, after the events of the first movie, but it doesn't bring back the final girl, Nancy Thompson. It involves a new character who moves into her old house, 1428 Elm Street. And I gotta say, the way that they involve Freddy in this movie, where he actually can somehow possess another person, in a way, I will admit I wasn't too fond of that originally, but I will say it definitely seems to be better than the original, or than the second movie of Halloween from the original franchise, if I'm being totally honest. Then we have A Nightmare on Elm Street 3, Dream Warriors. Now, this is the first time we get to see Nancy Thompson back 6 years later, and she's the only one who understands what some of these kids are going through who are having the same nightmares of Freddy. And I'll admit, I was pretty surprised that they killed off Nancy Thompson in this movie, but they made it so that the legacy of Freddy could kind of live on. And I'll admit, I actually do still think it's better than Halloween Kills, at least. It wasn't a great film by any means, but I still thought it was an okay film. Then we move on to the Dream Master. And I gotta say, this is the one where a lot of the characters from the third movie, Dream Warriors, are actually killed off, and however, one of the characters passes on their ability to drag people into their dreams to another girl named, I think her name was Alice, and she's the main character for the next 2 Friday Nightmare on Elm Street movies, including this one. And I gotta say, I was pretty surprised with how they handled her arc in this movie. But I will say, I still didn't think it was as good as the third movie. I will say, the first 3 Nightmare on Elm Street movies were actually not that bad. I do think the original one was definitely like the best one. Plus, I think it was the only Nightmare on Elm Street to be directed by Wes Craven before he unfortunately passed away a couple of years ago. So, next up we have A Nightmare on Elm Street 5, The Dream Child, I think is what it's called. Now, this is the last one before we get to see like a collab between Freddy Krueger and another iconic horror icon that we're about to get to his franchise in a second. But for now, we've got this movie. And I will say this is we don't actually know what happens to Alice and her unborn baby, but this movie does kind of explain why Freddy Krueger was born into the world or whatever of the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise, and why he and after he died, why he was able to haunt kids' dreams and kill them in their sleep and all that sort of stuff. I will say this was sort of an improvement from the fourth movie when it comes to telling that story. Heck, I even think it was better than Dream Warriors. I still don't think it was as good of a movie, though. Then we move on to Freddy vs. Jason. Now, again, the reason why I put Freddy vs. Jason before the Friday the 13th franchise, before we rank those, is because, again, Freddy is the first one to get introduced in the title, and we just ranked all the Nightmare on Elm Street movies. But with Jason, with Freddy vs. Jason, this movie sort of picks up where the fifth Nightmare on Elm Street left off. Actually, I think there was another movie that I haven't managed to watch just yet called The Final Nightmare or something that involves Freddy Krueger's son and daughter that appears in that movie. It seems like after the events of that movie, it's revealed why Freddy's trying to find Jason and revive him to get him to cause more fear in the minds of everybody in that town. And I will say this was a pretty good matchup. Seeing Freddy Krueger versus Jason Voorhees from the Friday the 13th movies, I cannot wait to see just how good this movie ends up being when it comes to the amount of stuff we see. But next up, not next up, but I will say I actually do love this movie. Heck, I think it beats out the Babysitter movies and the second Halloween and Nightmare on Elm Street films, but I still thought it was good enough to where it probably ended up. I'm curious to see like where they decide to go if they ever decide to reboot both franchises, because that's the thing too. We kind of saw a reboot with Friday the 13th, which didn't. We're gonna get to that movie once we finish this video. But next we got the original Friday the 13th. We're starting the Friday the 13th franchise with Jason Voorhees. Now, funny enough, he doesn't actually show up in this first movie. It's just like with what Ghostface said in the first ever movie of the Scream universe, where he said it was Jason's mother, Mrs. Voorhees, who was the killer, and that Jason didn't fully show up until the sequel.
And you should know Jason's mother, Mrs. Voorhees, was the original killer. Jason didn't show up until the sequel.
But anyways, when it comes to the original film with Mrs. Voorhees being the killer, it's revealed why she wants to kill everyone who comes to Camp Crystal Lake, which is where the events of most of the films take place. And it's funny because Crystal Lake is actually a town too, and anyone in that town that even dares to try to go near that place gets killed. And I will say the first movie I really enjoyed. In fact, it's almost on par with, I think I actually like it over just behind Megan. It's still in the A category, and I really did like the way they introduced Jason as a character with his mother in this movie, especially once we move on to the sequel with where it's revealed that Jason never actually died and never drowned, and he apparently saw his mother being decapitated by the final girl of that movie, and so he wanted to get back at her and then go back to his roots at Camp Crystal Lake. And anyone who tries to go back to that camp or reopen it will get killed. And now they don't necessarily reopen the camp, but nearby they do open up a camp counselor's training facility in a way, and that's where he decides to kill off these people because he doesn't think, especially because he was afraid they may try to open the camp up again with these counselors. And I will say the second movie, I will say I do like it more than Freddy vs. Jason, but it's not on par with some of these Scream movies, though. Now we get on to the third Friday the 13th. Now, this is the movie, unfortunately, that if you can't see, I put in twice by accident, but it's totally fine. We'll just feature this one. But with the third movie, this one we actually get introduced to another group of kids who apparently are staying at this farmhouse on Crystal Lake, in the town of Crystal Lake, and it's funny because it seems like Jason wasn't killed. He tries so hard to find all these people who that he thinks will reopen the camp, and it seems like he just wants to kill anybody who's in Crystal Lake. Plus, and I will say, this is actually the very first Friday the 13th movie where we get to see his iconic hockey mask that he's known for. And I gotta say, I love the way they introduced it, I guess, in a way, but I didn't like some of the characters in this movie. In fact, I think I still would have preferred these movies over the third movie. I thought it was okay, but not as good as I thought. Now we move on to the fourth Friday the 13th, that is where it's actually called the final chapter, even though they continued with the franchise after that, where this young girl and her brother are are going to this house that's in Crystal Lake. But it seems like Freddy just moved away from trying to get people away from his being too close to his campsite, and then it turns out he wants to just kill anyone who is just sexually attracted to each other, and apparently it's revealed that there is one character in this movie that actually is on the hunt for Jason to try to finish him once and for all, which is why they called this movie the final chapter, because it turns out this guy who's in the movie is trying to get payback with Jason for one of the characters from the first three movies that end up getting killed by him. So I will say I did say it was a little bit better than the third movie. In fact, I may even say it's better than these two movies. But then we start to get into the other four movies in in this universe that ended up, to me, they ended up just being unnecessary movies in a way. First, we get Friday the 13th Part 5, A New Beginning, where it's funny because the young boy who was the brother of the final girl in the fourth movie, he actually, during that movie, he was so it seemed like he had a lot of trauma after he made himself look like a young Jason Voorhees and killed and stabbed him a bunch of times trying to kill him. And he ended up going to this sort of group home type place where he was going to try to get psychiatric help, and then it's revealed that but then it makes it seem like he's going to be the new Jason Voorhees during this movie. And then we find out but then the sixth movie kind of contradicts that. And I will say this movie, to me, I think I still thought it was a lot better than maybe these Halloween movies, but not as much as I was hoping for. Then we move on to Jason Lives, the sixth Friday the 13th movie. Now this is the one where they contradict, like I said, what happens in A New Beginning, where they make it seem like the young boy who seemed to be as obsessed with killing people as Jason was, he goes to try to fully finish him once and for all, but unfortunately this is where he sort of comes back as like an actual zombie, and it seemed like you couldn't kill him in a way. And they do go back to Camp Crystal Lake though after this, where they try to put him back in his resting place where he was first drowned once and for all. And I will say, I do like that they tried to do that. Heck, I even think it's on par with I think I do like it more than the fourth Nightmare on Elm Street, but just barely. And then we get to the next two Friday the 13th movies in this franchise made no sense to me. I mean, episode 7 or part 7, A New Blood. It seemed like this one involved a girl that had psychic powers that could see things before they happen, and it seemed like they were like Jason, and unfortunately they freed Jason from his watery prison at the bottom of Camp Crystal Lake. And I will say I do think it's not as good as I do still think it's better. I think it's actually the worst one between these three, but we're about to get to the worst one next, and that's Friday the 13th Part 8, Jason Takes Manhattan. Now, it's funny because we just talked about Scream 6 a little earlier, and that movie also took place in New York, but I will say the way they told the New York story in that movie was way better than how they did it with this one. In fact, you guys might find this shocking, but this is the only movie that I'm actually putting in the F tier as the worst horror movie I've ever seen out of all these films. I gotta say, I did not like the way they portrayed New York in this manner, and they even made the way Jason gets fully taken out in this movie was ridiculous. And I gotta say, I'm hoping that, but again, he had somewhat of a redemption arc in the Freddy vs. Jason movie, as you can clearly tell. But now we get on to the last movie of this list, the 2009 Friday the 13th remake / reboot. Now, it sort of ties in the events of the first Friday the 13th and the second Friday the 13th. Or actually, no, it sort of ties in the events of the first Friday the 13th movie. And I will say, I think some aspects of the second movie were also featured, but this is sort of like a retelling of those two stories, just different aspect. And it completely introduces a new character who apparently is trying to go to Crystal Lake to find his sister or his sibling or whoever it was. And I will say, Jason and the way he does traps in this movie was a lot better than I expected. Heck, I actually think it's better than these movies in a way. I don't think it's better than Freddy vs. Jason, though. I thought that movie was a little bit better when it comes to those two being paired up. So, there you have it. That's my list for the not Friday the 13th. That's my list for my tier list for all the horror movies that I have ever seen so far. Now, there were a few I did see that I did not feature on this list, like the two It movies, and I think I even forgot to put the 9th Friday the 13th movie in here, Jason Goes to Hell. But that's mainly because, to me, that kind of was as bad as Jason Takes Manhattan, but I felt I only needed one solid movie in the F tier, and I managed to have one movie in the S tier with the original Nightmare on Elm Street. Now, I'm not sure if I'm still going to do this video, but the next tier list video that I'm going to try to do is actually going to be the first time I'm not ranking a movie or a show or anything like that, but individual characters from these horror films, both the killers and the final characters, and how I think they did in their films. So, anyways, that's all for now in this review. Not review, what am I saying? That's all for this tier list, and as always, I will see all you guys in the next video.